It's an honor to be here, and I appreciate the fact that so many of you came out on, well, I'm coming from the South. For me, it's pretty darn cold outside, so thank you for coming through this bit of weather. Well, let me begin by thanking Father Massa and the Boise Center for the invitation to speak here this evening. It's a high honor. I think the world of the Boise Center, and a longtime fan of Boston College Jesuit educated myself. And it is also, I think, a distinct honor, frankly, to be here offering a lecture named for a scholar whom I have long admired, Professor Alan Wolfe. So doubly honored, very grateful to be here. As you heard, I was a professor of political philosophy and political theory for many years at the Catholic University of America. Since retiring from academia, though, in 2018, I've not really had much of an opportunity to interact with scholars. COVID had a little bit to do with that, too, now that I think about it. Especially, I haven't had much of an opportunity to interact with Catholic scholars. So it's a special treat for me here this evening to have so many Catholic-educated scholars in the room. If I might begin with a little aside for those of you who are Catholic scholars, I'd like to recommend strongly that we would do well to revisit the documents of Vatican II as they relate to the Church's understanding of liberties. One of these I particularly recommend is Dignitatis Humanae, the Council's Declaration on Religious Freedom. Too often today, I think, Catholic theologians consider Dignitatis through the lens of the tensions it sparked with traditionalists like Lefebvre, or from the vantage point of ecumenism and interfaith dialogue. Well, both are valid angles for interpretation. In fact, if you've been following Catholic integralism lately, you'll have noticed that they have a major stumbling block in Dignitatis. So though it's a valid point from which to consider the doctrine, nevertheless, I think what's missing from these viewpoints is the extraordinary importance that Dignitatis has for reconciling Catholic theology with modernity's democratic political order, an order based on liberalism's rights and liberties. In the way that Dignitatis addresses freedom of conscience and belief, it is a toolkit for building out a theory of liberal democracy from Catholic teachings, or at the very least, in our times. Nationalism and Catholic integralism. This can provide many elements of a Catholic apology for liberalism. If there's time, I will return to a discussion of Dignitatis and liberal democracy at the conclusion of this evening's talk. And it's certainly an area I'd be glad to take questions. First, though, let me explain how I came to see religious nationalism as the crisis that it is for religious liberty. And by the way, this is the only slides tonight. Madeline asked me if I would prepare some slides, and I said I would. But in fact, I did not prepare any slides. So pretend this isn't here. I will occasionally do this and offer your imaginations an opportunity to insert a slide in this location. So the slide should say at this point, the insight, okay? The insight. All right, so here's the insight. As you heard from the awfully generous introduction from Father Massa, I'm a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USERF as it's called. And for the past year, it's been I don't know what the right word is here. I have responsibility down in my text, but I don't think it really conveys the sense of gravity that you feel about it. It's been my responsibility to bear witness to what is clearly a global epidemic of violence, persecution, and calculated discrimination directed at people because of what they believe or because of what they don't believe. I've met with victims, their representatives and families in embassy rooms, places of worship, refugee camps, offices of NGOs and government ministries. I've endured being surveilled openly and clandestinely by government operatives. I've been lectured to by various government officials and ambassadors. I've been informed that I'm blacklisted from entry into some countries. What I've seen documented and what I have witnessed personally should give pause to any who doubt the value of modernity's political order based on liberalism's human rights. In particular, it has become utterly clear from my observations that rights of conscience, religion, and belief are not only essential for human life and dignity, they are critical rights, and in fact, I would argue foundational rights for democracy and any just political order. This was certainly the conclusion in 1948 after the defeat of the authoritarian Axis powers, when the United Nations pronounced in its Declaration of Human Rights that, oh, and this is the time for another slide. Okay, so this is Article 18 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. Article 18. Article 18 is essentially the criterion for USERF's assessment of freedom of religion and belief around the world. We often shorten that to the acronym FORB. USERF monitors states and large non-state international entities, not from an American standpoint, not even from the standpoint of U.S. foreign policy, but rather based on international law and declarations like Article 18. Our mandate is to recommend U.S. laws and policies to the United States to respond to foreign violations abroad. USERF's recommendations go to Congress, they go to the administration, they go to the State Department, other departments like Treasury and Defense, and so forth. This is probably a good time, and maybe this should be a slide too now that I think about it. This is probably a good time for me to stress that my talk tonight reflects my own thoughts, my own opinions, and I'm not speaking tonight on behalf of USERF. I'm not representing the Commission's work in any way. This is just Steve Schneck you're hearing tonight. But as a commissioner in the summer of 2022, after I was appointed by President Biden, I was sent on a mission with 2 staff members to determine the conditions facing refugees from Myanmar. These are mostly Christian undocumented communities in Malaysia, and mostly Muslim Rohingya refugee community camps, really, in Bangladesh. There are other scattered communities, by the way, in India and in Thailand, and even Indonesia. We have many refugee crises in our world today. I ask that you please do not forget these millions of Myanmar refugees living in utterly horrible conditions in sanctioned and unsanctioned camps in Bangladesh, Thailand, India, and Malaysia. This would be, imagine a slide here of a ninja child playing in a cesspool with a toy. It's just a tiny glimpse of what I saw in some of these camps. Myanmar's refugees are victims of a horrific religious persecution by a militant Theravada Buddhist nationalism. A religious nationalism that metastasized in Myanmar over the last decade, seizing the government with a coup in February of 2021. The U.S. government has labeled this particular persecution a genocide, which speaks not only to the military violence that the Myanmar regime has used against its victims, but also to that government's systematic efforts to erase any religious culture contrary to Buddhism in the country. Indeed, it was amidst a very emotional stay at the Rohingya camp near Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh that the clear linkage between religious nationalism and such persecution became obvious to me. It was there that I became convinced that religious nationalism poses a profound danger to human rights and democracy, and indeed poses a danger to religion itself. The dimming of religious liberty. From that initial insight, the dire global situation for Ford came into stark relief for me. Numerous organizations have tracked a frightening spike in government's infringements of Ford over the last decade or so. USERF tracks this. So too does the State Department. So too does the United Nations and many NGOs as well. At the Cox's Bazar camps, I perceived how closely this spike was associated with this same surging religious nationalism. And here, the missing chart should be parallel charts showing spiking religious nationalism and spiking incidents against religious liberty around the world. Now, to be clear, religious nationalism is not the only threat to freedom of religion or belief. For example, the Ortega regime's persecution of the Catholic Church in Nicaragua is not really associated with the promotion of a religious nationalism. Likewise, the increasingly violent conflict between the Muslim Fulani herders and Christian villagers in Nigeria is also not obviously driven by Christian nationalism. That said, in many other countries, the dimming of religious freedom and freedom of conscience is directly associated with the rise of right-wing religious nationalism, as I'll explore this evening in examples from India and Hungary. While in many other countries, religious nationalism is obviously a contributing factor, as for example, with the Orthodox nationalism in Putin's Russia. In fact, of the 28 countries identified by USERF either as countries of particular concern or recommended for the State Department's special watch list, fully half reflect situations where religious nationalism is a major factor. And well beyond USERF's current lists of the worst possible actors, right-wing religious nationalist movements are active in dozens of other countries around the world, including the United States and much of Europe. Now let me turn to two countries to illustrate the ways in which religious nationalism imperils liberty, religious liberty, and freedom of belief. And the two that I'm choosing here are India and Hungary. I'll start with India, of course. In 1992, Hindu mobs, intent on constructing a temple to Balak Ram on the site, destroyed the Babri Mosque in Ayodhya, which prompted years of sectarian violence with thousands dead. That mosque had stood on that ground for more than 400 years before it was torn down. The razing of the mosque became a template for what the Indians themselves call bulldozer justice, a term that's been used to justify the lynching of minority religious men, Muslims and Christians, as well as Dalits accused of cow slaughter, the beating of interfaith couples, and the demolishing of non-Hindu homes by government authorities. That same mosque destruction also ignited a militant Hindu nationalism that fueled the rise of the party commonly called the BJP and brought Prime Minister Narendra Modi to power. And And 2 weeks ago from today, Modi led national celebrations in the inauguration of an enormous temple to Ram on the site of that former mosque. This would be the time for a slide of Prime Minister Modi celebrating in front of this enormous mosque that's now been built, or an enormous temple that's now been built on the site of the former mosque. In India, the government at the national, state, and local levels employs religiously discriminatory policies, including laws targeting religious conversion, interfaith relationships, the wearing of hijabs, cow slaughter, laws which negatively impact essentially all non-Hindu religions. By this I include Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Dalits, Jains, Parsis, Buddhists, and even indigenous peoples and tribes. The government also censors critics of Hindu nationalism by surveillance, harassment, demolition of property, and detention, and targets both domestic and international civil society organizations that might have some interest in promoting religious liberty within India. So, journalists, lawyers, civil rights activists, and religious minorities advocating for religious liberty are surveilled, detained, and prosecuted under various laws, mostly under the umbrella of national security. Hundreds of cases remain pending, for example, against individuals involved in the 2019 peaceful protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act, which was a discriminatory law designed to erase any path toward citizenship for non-Hindu immigrants. And hundreds of those protesters from 2019 are still in prison without an opportunity to even address the situation of their imprisonment. The United Nations' most recent review of the situation in India lambasted the country's human rights record on religious liberty and criticized specifically the abuse of India's anti-terror laws for religious discrimination. Several of India's various state governments have enacted and enforced anti-conversion laws, including laws that criminalize interfaith marriage. Vigilante mobs act with impunity to attack those who might be involved in interfaith relationships. In its 2022 platform, and I should mention that the party has just last year won again essentially the entire government in India. In its 2022 platform, the BJP party endorsed implementation of even harsher penalties against interfaith marriage. In the last few years alone, destruction of property, including places of worship in predominantly Muslim and Christian neighborhoods, has risen dramatically. Many Muslim homes have been destroyed. Several Muslim madrasas have been razed after government officials in Assam called for their destruction. Instances of sexual violence against Muslim women are almost never prosecuted, even in instances where such attacks have been broadcast on social media. In 2022, Hindu nationalists bulldozed a Catholic center in Bangalore and attacked and looted and destroyed homes of hundreds of Christians for their refusal to convert to Hinduism. In 2023, just last year, more than 200 Christian churches were destroyed in Manipur, both Protestant and Catholics, as well as 2 Jewish synagogues. The government appears to show little interest in prosecuting those involved in this violence. These slides get more and more desperate. Imagine now a slide of the burned churches and synagogue here. Government officials in India are often seen employing disinformation and hate speech on social media platforms against minority religions. Transnationally, the Indian government has been indicated in the assassination of the Sikh leader Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Canada, and here in the United States involved in the assassination plot against Gurpatwan Singh Patnan in the United States. I could list many more examples of the ways in which religious nationalism in India is resulting in a profound crisis for religious liberty. The pattern is clear over the history of this phenomenon. A fringe, militant Hindu nationalism that hovered in the background of Indian politics since colonial times, kept smoldering on life support by a handful of extremists, such as those associated with the paramilitary RSS group, the group that essentially worked to assassinate Gandhi, suddenly becomes mainstream under the auspices of the BJP party and its charismatic leader and former RSS member, Narendra Modi. So the Indian pattern then, here's time for a slide again, it's going to be in 3 steps. The Indian pattern looks like this. First, there's an original, somewhat ancient, old, extremist religious bias in a fringe group within Indian politics. Second, that bias and the manifestation of that fringe group is kindled and normalized by a charismatic leader who uses it, third, to advance a political agenda that, as we see, imperils liberalism's human rights in general and religious liberty in particular. The question to ask, though, is to what extent this pattern is to be found elsewhere where religious nationalism is growing. For example, might the order of steps that we see in the Indian situation be jumbled? Might an otherwise relatively secular right-wing religious nationalism merely deploy religious nationalism in an instrumental fashion to justify its own illiberalism? Well, of course, you can imagine I'm setting you up for Hungary now. So, another slide. Hungary is the next slide here. The overt governmental persecution of minority religions and intercommunal violence that marks religious nationalism in India is frankly not on display in Hungary. Hungary is not a country of particular concern for USERF, not on the State Department's special watch list. Likewise, for the NGOs that index countries on the basis of religious liberty, Hungary is typically ranked middling high, somewhere below most of Europe and North America, but above, and in many cases much above, the rest of the world. Yet Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban and his utterly dominant Fidesz party increasingly speak openly in support of Christian nationalism, and incidents of tension with minority religions are rising, as are examples of discriminatory governmental policies, and violence and harassment aimed at institutions and individuals belonging to minority faiths are also on the rise. Both anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred are on the rise. The politics of Hungary over the last 2 decades have been defined by a number of obvious concerns that we should be aware of. Foremost is the migration crisis that's impacting so much of Europe. Successive events in the Middle East since the Gulf Wars have driven millions of mostly Muslim refugees to seek security and better life in Europe. Likewise, climate change and regional violence in North Africa and the Sahel are also inclining large numbers of, again, mostly Muslim migrants toward Europe. Even relatively welcoming countries such as Germany and Sweden have had their politics roiled by this influx of migration. Hungary was especially on the front lines for these waves of immigration, particularly those from Syria and northern Iraq. So perhaps predictably, Hungarian right-wing parties adopted a hardline stance against this migration and against migrants themselves, pushing policies that blocked and expelled migrants and that targeted even legally admitted migrants for discrimination. Numerous examples of individual violence against these migrants and minority religious and ethnic populations were noted. Here we might imagine a slide of Hungarian border guards building barriers of razor wire. A second factor to consider in regards to the Hungarian situation is a stubborn suspicion of liberal Western institutions in rural areas, among the working class, and among pensioners. Politically, this manifests as a hostility toward Western European support for diversity, such as gay rights or DEI policies and multiculturalism in general. For some reason, I suspect that this suspicion is lingering. For some, I suspect this suspicion is lingering nostalgia for the presumed stability of things before the dramatic changes after the fall of the Iron Curtain. But there are current realities that may inform this suspicion as well. Hungary has extremely high youth unemployment. And I should note, by the way, curiously, that the strongest anti-immigrant attitudes and, as we'll see later, the strongest attitudes against Muslims and Jews in Hungary are among the young people rather than the middle-aged or older people. So high youth unemployment. There's also a widening income gap in Hungary, particularly along urban-rural lines. Smokestack industries there are struggling to compete in the global economy, and anxiety on the part of the pensioners regarding the state's provision of income, housing, and Medicare. All of these things, I think, can be factored into our efforts to understand some of the historical reasons behind what we're seeing. Finally, anti-Semitism has an ancient history in Hungary that in some ways has been unleashed in recent years. We should not forget that Hungary was allied with Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy before and during the Second World War. Its troops fought alongside the Wehrmacht in several theaters. In the 1930s, Hungary passed anti-Jewish laws that were directly inspired by similar measures in Germany. In 1944, Hitler sent German troops to occupy Hungary in order to bolster its resistance against the Soviet forces, and at that time, mass deportation of Jews from Hungary to Auschwitz and Birkenau began. Hungarian authorities in those months sent nearly 500,000 Jews to the camps before their leader, Miklos Horthy, seeing the coming end of the Axis powers, eventually halted the deportations later in that year. After 1989, the fall of the wall, several extremist anti-Semitic groups emerged with varying degrees of success in Hungarian politics. And over the last decade and a half, anti-Semitism has escalated and to a certain extent been normalized publicly. Right-wing extremists and neo-Nazi gatherings attract large audiences in public events. There are reports of Jewish cemeteries being vandalized, and prominent Jews report harassment. George Soros, who can be a punching bag here in the United States, is regularly a punching bag in the Hungarian media as a representative of an alleged international Jewish conspiracy. In fact, the Anti-Defamation League identifies Hungary today as the most anti-Semitic country in Europe, with more than 40% of the population reporting some level of anti-Semitic views. Thinking about all of these factors in Hungarian history as context, let me now turn specifically to the Christian nationalism of Viktor Orban and the Fidesz party. Coming to power first in 2010, it's a little unclear precisely when the features of Orban's religious nationalism gel. However, in 2012, the preamble of the Hungarian constitution was amended under Fidesz to declare that Hungary was founded as part of a quote-unquote Christian Europe, and that Christianity has a role to play in preserving its nationhood. In 2015, the Orban government passed stringent laws designed to limit asylum for Muslim immigrants and built a border fence, the razor wire I mentioned before, to block their entry. At the same time, he pronounced Hungary to be, these are his words, and I'm quoting, an illiberal democracy, and criticized what he called, again, these are his words, multiculturalism, which he defined as, his words again, coexistence of Islam, Asian religions, and Christianity, saying, we will do everything to spare Hungary from this. In 2019, he stated that the essence of, again I'm quoting from him, the essence of a liberal democracy is Christian liberty and the protection of Christian liberty. Additional constitutional revisions in 2018 and 2020 redefined Hungary as a Christian nation and obligated all government agencies to promote Christian culture. In 2022, in the wake of the uproar following Orban's notorious remarks in opposition to race mixing, Orban at a CPAC conference in Texas called for Christian nationalists in the United States and Europe to unite our forces to defend the fundamental values of Christian civilization. Here you can imagine a slide of Orban in Texas at the CPAC conference. Different from Hindu nationalism in India, I see the Christian nationalism in Hungary not as the driver of a political movement, but rather as a post facto effort to justify or legitimate or perhaps even to market a political movement. By all accounts, Orban was for most of his life an agnostic. Hungary itself in modern times has never been an intensely religious country. Even today, despite the meme of religious nationalism used by its political leadership, Christian church attendance in Hungary is among the lowest in Europe. We all know how low church attendance in Europe is. Arguably, the Fidesz leadership found Christian nationalism to be an effective appeal amidst Hungarian identity politics in order to bless its anti-Muslim immigrant policies in 2015 and thereafter. Christian nationalism can invoke an almost tribal identity of us versus them, and suspicion of what is different or other, as Muslim immigrants from Syria or northern Iraq have seen. Those wishing to review, it's easy to imagine how this also overlays with the Fidesz party's tensions with Western Europe and its opposition to globalism. That said, it in no way diminishes the very real danger that Hungary's Christian nationalism poses to freedom of religion or belief. The escalation of incidents of anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred in Hungary is surely not coincidental. Moreover, in recent years, other minority religions are also being impacted, including independent Protestant churches, Scientologists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others. And those wishing to review such cases may wish to refer to the State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom, which tracks the situation in Hungary, as well as many other nations. Okay, now it's time for the slide that says conclusion. India and Hungary are just two examples illustrating what I see as a worldwide escalation of religious nationalism and its threats to freedom of religion and belief. I could have just as easily spoken of a dozen other countries as illustration. What's happening around the world is real and should concern us all. The freedoms of conscience, religion, and belief are in many ways canaries in the coal mine for authoritarian threats to the liberal political order. Similarly, these rights are on the front lines. I want to repeat that. They're on the front lines for any defense that can be mounted against religious nationalism. And now let me make what I think is a very important point. If freedom of conscience and belief are the front lines to defend against religious nationalism, then it's particularly incumbent on believers, on people of faith, to stand up and be the most effective spokesperson in advocating for those freedoms. Let me phrase that slightly differently and repeat it. To defend against the dangers of religious nationalism, people of faith are the best for speaking out for religious liberty, for freedom of conscience and belief. In speaking out for religious liberty and freedom of conscience and belief, moreover, we are also lending support toward a political order based on human rights and liberties. An order that is now under siege in country after country by an authoritarian tide that neuters those same rights and freedoms because it fears citizens finding sources of truth or moral authority that might compromise the power of the dear leader or his party. Yet there are obstacles that stand in the way of people of faith speaking up in the way that I think that they need to. Here again, maybe we can imagine a slide because I'm going to list three obstacles that I think that need to be recognized. In the first place, and here I can think about this in the context of the United States as well. In the first place, I believe liberalism must rediscover for itself the importance of these fundamental rights and freedoms. They need to become salient again in the way that we talk about our politics. The historical recognition of these rights in the 17th and 18th centuries, following the religious wars of the 16th century, is too often just a foggy memory for those today who might be worried about the rise of religious nationalism. Focused as contemporary times have been on substantive rights, like health care and social justice, the more formal rights and freedoms that are the foundation of our liberal order have slipped from our attention span. And frankly, for some, formal rights are even viewed askance to the extent that they are seen as procedural obstacles that should be sidestepped for speedy transformational changes towards social justice. Yet, liberalism's foundational rights and freedoms are today's targets for political movements like religious nationalism that would set the cause of social justice back centuries. That's my first point, first obstacle. Second obstacle. Relatedly and secondly, the ability to speak for freedoms of conscience, religion, and belief, the ability to speak for them is itself under assault and limited. Authoritarian governments, of course, curtail avenues for expression that might challenge their grip on minds and hearts. Laws ostensibly to combat terrorism and hate speech and to preserve social harmony or religious harmony are widely used to curb authentic calls for freedom of religion or belief. Vigilante mobs on social media can be just as effective as government action in squelching such calls. Even democracies can see rights succumb to popular tyrannies. That's my second obstacle. And the third and final obstacle. Finally, among people of faith, liberal defenders of human rights and the political order are unfortunately loath, it seems, to take up the cause. Religion has become psychologically associated with the political right, even for religious believers, even for liberal believers. And owing to the political polarization of our times, few liberals feel comfortable mixing in religious circles, much less speaking out for religion in any capacity. A week ago, I attended an international conference on freedom of religion and belief, and I can attest that the social ecology of religious liberty is overwhelmingly populated by the religious right, even including any number of religious nationals. This needs to change. Liberals must find their voice in defending freedom of conscience or belief in the face of religious nationalism and the threats it poses to liberal democracy. Those are the obstacles. Now, the last slide that you'll see. This is a slide of my asks to the folks here in this room. Thinking about that last point, about how loath it seems for liberals to speak up for religious liberty. Let me return briefly with the aside about dignitatis humanae that I mentioned in my opening. This is a room full of Catholic scholars interested in this topic. And so I'm addressing you all directly. I have 4 asks. First, I ask you scholars to take up the cause of speaking up for freedom of religion and belief as a response to religious nationalism, and particularly as a response to its sister ideology, Catholic integralism. Second, I ask you to push back as Catholic scholars against the rise of religious nationalism and the dimming of religious liberty, composing a Catholic argument for liberal human rights based on the Church's teaching about human dignity. Third, I ask you to build out from such a Catholic defense of freedom of religion and belief a more fulsome understanding of the same liberal order. And in so doing, I ask you finally, 4th point, I ask you to in so doing, lay down the bones of a Catholic apology for the liberal political order and liberal democracy. And with those 4 asks, ladies and gentlemen, and professors and Catholic scholars, thank you very much.
I think this is a question, but let me start with a question. As you know, the Pew Trust put out a study of Christian nationalism in the United States, which my faculty seminar read a couple of weeks ago. The surprising statistic in that was that the majority of Christian nationalists aren't practicing Christians in the United States, but they are not church members, and they see Christianity as a tribal identification more than a religious or a theological identification. Is that typical of religious nationalism and other?
It certainly maps with, a situation like we see in Hungary, where, the Christian nationalism doesn't seem to actually be connected with any sort of real Christianity. It's much more about national identity. It's much more about, frankly, national and race identity. I think there, and I suspect that what Pew has discovered is that the same thing is true here in the United States. That what we call religious nationalism is really about nationalism rather than it's about religion. And religion just becomes a marker for identity somehow. That's a good question. I think it's less true in places. The example that I gave from India, I think, is less true, because there I think that it seems like it's an organic movement within Hinduism itself. Good question, though, to start things out.
I just want to say that in India it's not organic either.
You don't think it's an organic in India as well?
I mean, the whole movement had to define itself. There is no sort of heart of Hinduism. So Savarkar in the beginning of the 20th century had to define what Hinduism was, and then people came on board because they saw it as a defense against colonialism and against Muslim domination for so many centuries.
So you think movements like RSS and the BJP party are crafting this. That would seem to be the situation in Hungary, for example. That's interesting. I could very well be wrong. Yes.
First of all, obvious for people who don't know, and most people, you and I go way back.
A little louder.
Is that safe to say?
Steve, could you hand him the mic?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm sure it's working. Is it on?
My name is I'll just speak louder. Oh. My name is Steve Kruger. I'm the head of an organization called Catholic Democrats. And through that, you and I have known each other for quite some time. First of all, let me say, our country is blessed to have a person of your knowledge to be on the commission doing this work. I think you bring a perspective, a balanced perspective, that's so important in today's political environment. And it's about the balanced perspective that I have both kind of a comment question. The title of the talk itself is somewhat skewed, in my opinion, because we're saying
You're
religious.
breaking my heart, but go ahead.
I asked you beforehand if I could ask a tough question, and you said yes. You're saying religious nationalism is dimming religious freedom, and I agree with that, and I think you made an excellent case. I'm most familiar with what goes on in our country, and I'm very aware of the politics of the day and the impact that it's having on religious freedom. And I'm going to do something I don't often do. I'm going to pretend that I'm here representing the U.S. bishops, who I'm often very critical of. But they just issued a report in January, their annual report on religious freedom. And they would take issue with a lot of policies of this administration and that are primarily being advanced by the Democratic Party that are having a profound negative impact on religious freedom. And so somewhere in your closing ask and somewhere in that reality, I think there's a question or a point for discussion. I think part of the point is we should not just be blaming the religious right for dimming religious freedom. You could argue that, certainly within our political context, there's a secularism in our society where religious freedom is of no importance. And so I'm wondering if you could share some of your thoughts on that, particularly with respect to what degree can the group of, you're calling scholars and presumably other activists forward, such as myself, to hold people accountable to this. I feel that the left has to be held accountable as well, and I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Could you hand the microphone back to Steve? Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. Obviously, I came here tonight to talk about religious nationalism and things like that, such as the. So thanks for the question. I came tonight to speak about religious nationalism and its impact on religious liberty, which I think is an important point, and one I think that many people who actually are excited about religious nationalism may not think about, may not recognize themselves. They think that they're actually advancing religion when in fact they're narrowing the space and closing opportunities for religious difference, for religion to be religion in many respects. So I mean, that's one thing that I'd say in response. That was what I wanted to talk about, how religious nationalism kind of does that. If your question is, what do I say about secularism as it relates to religious liberty? And I think that secularism too, to the extent that it works to constrain the liberty to practice religion, can in fact do the same sort of thing. That it can narrow the space for religious expression in all sorts of ways. And I think that we've seen that here in the United States. We've seen that in Western Europe. We also see that really around the world. Government actions, whether they're liberal or conservative or whatever, often in order to retain power, in order to enhance power, often are involved in constraining the kinds of liberties such as religious liberty. So I think that's clear, but that's, as I said, not something that I really intended to address. Let me go to the very back row. Yes, sir.
I just start off saying thank you. Kind of really informative. My question, I guess, is kind of similar to what you were saying at the end regarding constraints on religious freedom. Recently, very kind of isolated case, FBI subpoenaed for kind of involvement in pursuing a traditional Catholic church in Richmond. And I'm not particularly keen on societies like the Society of St. Pius X. Thank you. With regard to their status, as a Catholic myself, but how that kind of weaponization almost is a term that has been used of law enforcement to kind of, and I would not claim that they aren't, maybe not part of a religious nationalism kind of strain, but do you think that could kind of be shooting the gun, so to speak, in a way of kind of trying to hop on things before they occur and how the American public might view that? Sorry, that was kind of long-winded and difficult to understand.
So I just want to be clear, you're asking me about the alleged involvement of the FBI in investigating certain movements within the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
That's what you're asking about. I'm not really, greatly familiar with that other than what I read in the newspaper, so I don't know a whole lot about that. But if we're going to take religious liberty seriously, in the way that I argue, we need to take religious liberty seriously. We take it seriously because it in the fullest sense, with as little limits as possible, because we recognize that freedom of conscience, that freedom of belief, that freedom to practice our beliefs in public life is essential for the political order that we all admire, that we all cherish. Then yes, to the extent that the FBI was actually doing that sort of thing, we should complain about it. I think that's pretty good legit. But I hope all the questions aren't going to be about the United States, guys.
I have another one about the U.S. Sorry.
Right.
And secularization. So I was wondering what you think the role of government and agencies like USRIF are in response to increasing secularization. And for example, I'm thinking of, thank you. I know recently there was the Satanic Temple had put on a shrine in the Iowa State House. I was wondering, do you think we need a redefining of religious liberty or even of religion itself in this modern age? And I keep in mind a quote from John Adams that the United States Constitution was designed for a moral and religious people.
I think that what it's interesting. I could be a little bit wrong about the date, but I think it was 1779 when Thomas Jefferson was the principal author of the a call for freedom of religion for the colony, later the state of, who will become the state of Virginia. And in that bill that was proposed that Jefferson wrote, he stated that we want religious freedom. I'm paraphrasing as well as I can remember. It's a long time ago since I was a graduate student. I've read this document personally. Paraphrasing, he said that God created the mind of human beings free so that they could be led by reason to determine what they believe and what they don't believe. And I actually think that's the essence of religious freedom that we want in a free society. That's the way in which we should be able to think about those things. We should be able to have a mind free to choose a different religion if we want a different religion. We should have a mind free to employ our reason to reject religious proposals by others that we find objectionable. And so, to the extent that you're proposing a way of imagining a role for religion in society in which that kind of freedom is denied, I guess I would disagree with you. And to the extent that there are people in our society that are proposing a way of thinking about what America is supposed to be in regards to the place of religion in its public life, if religion is actually in any way to infringe on that freedom of mind that Jefferson talked about, then I would say that it's contrary to the thinking of the framers. Yes, Kevin.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was absolutely fascinating and gave me a lot to think about. I suppose my question is going to, I'm not trying to say take the side of religious illiberty, but the question might sound this way. So when I think of places like Hungary and places on the verge, Germany, which are getting a lot of Muslim immigrants, part of what I think people are worried about is the threats that these traditions and the way they conceive of morality and public life posing to, at least in Germany, a liberal democracy itself. When you think about freedom of religion, there's almost concentric circles, right? There's freedom of belief on the one hand, what I think in my head, and you just talked about that, that's fine. Then there's freedom of worship around that, where I go, how I do what I do. And then there's sort of freedom of action, which impinges not just on me, but on other people, including other people's rights. So I think what people can be worried about, and sometimes legitimately, or possibly legitimately, is whether the new immigrants coming in are going to be absorbed into, say, our liberal democracy and value equality of all people, equality of all races, equality of women, and act accordingly, or whether they are going to act against those values. Now, this was a worry about Catholics coming into Puritan, New England many years ago, and it turns out we were sort of corrupted by liberal democracy, right? And then from some people's point of view, we corrupted the church with dignitatis humanae. But it doesn't always have such a happy ending, right? You can have people who come in and who say, well, this isn't the way we want to run things, and we're the majority now, so we're going to change things. So I guess what I would like to ask you is, do you think there are any legitimate fears that have to be addressed, not simply by proclaiming the importance of religious liberty, but maybe taking extreme measures to, not extreme as in immoral, but, vigorous measures to inculcate the values of liberal democracy in people who may not already see those values?
Yeah, good question, Kathy. You know as well as I the kind of the layers of the onion
by which we think about the exercise about liberty in this regard. We probably both had John Stuart Mill in mind when you were actually saying that sort of thing. And so, for those of you who don't have Mill at the top of your mind, Mill imagines that sort of at the core you have complete, unhindered. No one should ever touch it. No government should ever be involved in it. No other person should kind of break into the sphere of absolute liberty to think and to believe what we want to believe. But that as we move further away in this layers of this onion, as we move from what is entirely in our heads to what we say, to what we do, to how we interact with other people, then gradually, the traditional liberal argument is as you move away from that pure liberty in your mind toward action and involvement in the world with others, then of course there's room for more limits on liberty. And frankly, of course that's true. Of course that's true. And so the Muslim influx into Europe, of course, is going to be very disturbing to society. It is proving to be very disturbing to society.
Especially on women.
Especially on women. But yeah, I agree. I'm not denying that at all. That said, while I'm not a perfect liberal in this regard, I do think that freedom should be granted to their religious practices to the extent that they're not truly harming others in society. It doesn't harm anyone if a Muslim woman decides to wear a hijab. It doesn't harm anyone if a Muslim woman chooses to live in a more separated domestic experience than most Western European women are used to. If it's in fact a choice, if it's their choice. So, I think that's kind of where I come down on those sorts of things. Yeah, it's going to be disturbing to society, no doubt about it, but nevertheless we have to protect their rights to think and believe differently, and even their practices to the extent that they're not actually causing harm. And a long discussion about harm, I'm sure, causing harm to others.
Steve, and this may require another slide. Could you say something explicitly? I mean, it's been implied through all you've been saying, but could you say something explicitly about the role of religious nationalism in our present political climate, especially in the emerging presidential campaigns? I mean, it's writ large in many ways and fairly dangerous, but I'd love to hear your take on it.
Well, I think that everybody heard the question.
But maybe explicit.
Okay, so I'm being asked to be explicit about the danger that religious nationalism poses. Are you asking about the domestic situation in the United States?
At this time
in the United States.
Presidential campaign.
All right. I mean, I hadn't really wanted to kind of weigh in on I should be clear, I'm the President Biden appointee to USERF, if you haven't already figured that out. USERF has 9 commissioners currently, and we're divided between the political parties. So some of my colleagues were appointed by Republican leadership in the House and the Senate. Other of my colleagues were appointed by Democratic leadership, and a few of us, like me, were appointed by President Biden. It's a bipartisan commission, pretty much evenly split, and it's not perfect, but it's one of the few places where I think bipartisanship sort of works in Washington these days. So the polarization is still there, but it's not. Doesn't really stand in the way of us doing our work. Okay, all that said, the domestic situation isn't one that I really wanted to go deeply into, but of course, everything that I've said about the danger that religious nationalism is exercising in India today, and everything that I said about the danger that religious nationalism is exercising in Hungary today, all of that could come with religious nationalism here in the United States. It's not. I mean, what we see happening there could happen here. It's a legitimate work. In fact, we already have noticed, it's quite obvious if you think about it, we've already noticed spiking anti-Semitism and spiking anti-Muslim hatred here in the United States. Words to that effect, in fact, coming from the mouths of many of these leaders within the religious nationalist movement in the United States. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that that's something to worry about, but, you know, I truly hadn't intended to speak so much about domestic issues. Yes, sir.
Returning to Hungary, I know you'll appreciate it.
Joe, wait.
That is not working. So don't know
I
why.
think the battery's up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm messing around, but it didn't do anything. So you mentioned the opposition to immigration of Muslims into Hungary. And how much of that really is a religious nationalism movement? Their religion is different from ours. We don't understand it. We don't like it. Therefore, we don't like them. And how much of it is the correlated economics? These folks are going to take jobs that we otherwise could have had, that our kids could have had. The same arguments, really without much evidence. You hear about the Mexican border. So it's really not religious nationalism, but it's basically economics correlated with the fact that these folks are a different religion.
Right. I'm not sure you can disentangle these things, to be honest with you. I think that I think there are multiple factors at play. I think race is a factor, and the fact that the Muslims coming into Central Europe these days are darker skinned. I think language is an issue. You know, they bring with them an entirely different culture, and they certainly pose difficulties of all sorts to government's effort to provide normal citizenship benefits to them, and so that comes. And yes, there's. I indicated the high youth unemployment in Hungary. I indicated the sense of alienation that Hungarian heavy industry workers feel about the failure of their industries in the global economy. Many of the same arguments that you hear employed about fear of immigrants in the United States taking jobs from Americans who need them are those arguments that you've heard in Hungary since 2015 as well. All of these things are true. But part of that, too, is the difference in religion. Part of it is an antipathy toward a religion that is not associated in the minds of many Hungarians with Hungarian identity. So I agree, but I just don't want to, completely take religion out of the question. Yes, sir.
How much of the nationalism do you think is motivated by the perception that religious freedom is dimming? Now, how many of these religious nationalists become religious nationalists because they feel that their own free exercise is being prevented, right? So, I don't want to sign this marriage license, for instance, because it goes against my religion. So I'm curious about a kind of vicious circle.
Yeah, in fact, that's such a good question, because that's probably what really has inspired me to talk about this kind of from the other side, we might say. So yeah, many of the people that are, to go back to an earlier question, the American Catholic bishops are complaining about, the erosion of religious liberty in the United States, and they're pointing to, Catholic hospitals and Catholic universities and things like that. In the same way, right-wing evangelicals in the United States are pointing at, a host of federal laws that they think in some way or another are impinging on their religious freedom. And so, yeah, there many of the people that find religious nationalism an avenue, something for them to subscribe to in regards to their political engagement, are, interested in it because they see it as a vehicle to advance their religious liberty. I just want to point out that it doesn't advance religious liberty. It may advance Hindu liberty in India. It may advance Christian liberty in Hungary, perhaps. but it's not advancing religious liberty per se. We just need to be really clear about that. And in fact, if I could talk just a little bit about Catholic integralists, I think this is particularly an effective argument to raise with Catholic integralists, because they need to face it squarely. That to the extent that they're buying into this way of thinking, they're actually closing out the space for religious liberty.
You could just talk for the students what integralism is.
Oh gosh, you should do that. You're the more of an expert. So, Father Massa has asked me to kind of explain what Catholic integralism is. I'm not even sure the Catholic integralists precisely know what it is. It seems to change in many respects.
Well, let me do a 1 minute thing.
There you
There's
go.
a very famous law professor at Harvard Law School who describes himself as a Catholic integralist. He believes that
We know who that is.
Yeah, no. He believes the First Amendment was a mistake. There should be no separation of church and state, and there should be no religious freedom whatsoever, and that the Catholic Church should be the official church of the United States.
That's
That's
for
it.
mule, right?
What?
That's for mule.
For mule.
No rule. I wasn't going to name.
No,
it.
I know. I'm sorry.
But so essentially, right, Catholic integralism is a variety of religious nationalism.
So, as Catholics, we are called to bring our faith to all aspects of our lives. So is maybe a fifth task for the room to craft a liberal sense of religious nationalism. I mean, people have to have a sense of national identity, right? I mean, you have to have that. That's part of any culture. And if we're going to leave it to the yahoos who want to make it a very exclusivist, I mean, it's that great Andy Main line, exclusively what and restricted to whom, right? Do we have to create a more positive, not just a rebuttal to the integralists? In the same way as, the Holy Father calls us to an integral understanding of the human person and human development in Laudato Si, and yet integralism becomes a pernicious ideology. What are the habits of mind that allow us to keep a liberal sense of these things without letting them lapse into, creepy ideological iterations?
I'm not sure we can square the circle, to be honest with you. My own thought on the topic of liberalism generally has gone through a number of stages. When I was right out of graduate school, I was utterly entranced with French post-structuralism, with Michel Foucault and Derrida. And so from that perspective, I looked at liberal rights and liberties. Oh, these are just bourgeois mechanisms for control. This is all just a really subtle way in which bourgeois society represses and maintains power. At least that's the way I thought about it when I was 31 or whatever the year was. And then the next phase that I went through, if I can talk about a phase, is I became sort of entranced with consociationalism, with Catholic distributism, and that idea that it's all about the community and the common good. And from that perspective, I criticized liberalism. So then I looked at at rights and liberal rights and liberties as these are just ways that separate us from the solidarity that we should really have with one another in a genuine Christian community. I have to say, Michael Sean, that in the year and a half that I've been going around the world for USERF and looking on the ground at people that are suffering from lack of human rights like religious liberty, I'm becoming more and more liberal and less supportive of that common good vision, for what it's worth.
One last question.
At the beginning, you talked about Article 18 and the freedom to convert out of one's religion, which for decades has been a sticking point with the Muslim majority world. Could you talk a little bit about what you see in your work with USERF in governments that are constitutionally Islamic, and on this point, and not as much in the question isn't as much about where laws are changing or aren't, but what do you see on the ground for trends on this question?
As you say, it's a tremendously difficult sticking point, throughout the Muslim world. Almost every Muslim country has varieties of anti-conversion laws, or if not literally anti-conversion laws, they have really complicated processes that one has to go through in order to leave the Muslim faith and become something else. One of the countries that I mentioned that I visited was Malaysia. And Malaysia has one of these very complicated things. If you can, in fact, give up your Muslim faith and become a Christian or a Hindu or whatever it might be, but to do so, you have to go to this sort of like a re-education camp and sort of stand up through, various levels of re-education, and still come out of it all and say, well, I listened to all of that, and yet I still want to be a Hindu or something like that. You can imagine just how difficult it is. So I'm not sure I answered your question there. So the question, could you rephrase the question?
Well, just do you see any substantial change either in law or in practice on the ground on this question?
Yes.
What trends do you notice?
Well, so at the governmental level, yes. At the governmental, almost all the, we were just about to send a delegation to Saudi this week, but it's just been canceled because of the situation in the Middle East. But the Saudi government even is making some adjustments in its laws to bring it closer to international standards in that regard, and that's the same thing that's occurring in Egypt. Places like Morocco are pretty far along. On the other hand, there are places that are going the other direction, and I don't mean places like the Taliban in Afghanistan, but even places like Algeria. Azerbaijan is currently backsliding a little bit on it, so it's but overall I see in the Muslim world a bit of progress that gives us that makes us think that those of us who are pushing for these changes in laws in these other countries are having some degree of success, but it's got a long way to go.
Please join me in thanking Steve.